Jason, it's amazing to have you here in the ISC conference. The speech you gave is very informative, quite intense, to be honest. How do you like the Saudi space right now digitally? The industries are growing and the demand for cybersecurity is also increased. But what change have you observed?
Yeah, one of the nice things about my job is I get to travel all around the world and see what different nations are doing. And I would argue that Saudi Arabia is doing a lot, like especially relative to a lot of other places. I'm not going to say which ones, right? But certainly all the investment, not only in the technology, but also the people and the different agencies. It seems that there is a top-down leadership effort, which I think is very important within the cybersecurity space. So certainly I would say that Saudi Arabia is doing a really commendable job in that.
You spoke about ransomware, and now, right now on the internet, there's a lot of talk about ransomware. But how do you think small organizations today can protect themselves from this threat?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is about understanding the problem that you're facing, but then also understanding what are the biggest high impact items that I can do to protect myself. So like basic hygiene, right? Obviously having a good AV solution, having visibility. During my presentation, I spoke about the need for identity-based solutions. So it's like taking like what is the majority of the problem and then focusing on those areas. The other area worth considering for small organizations is using managed service capabilities. So a lot of organizations might not necessarily have either the funds or the people to do it all themselves. So there's a lot of great partners out there that are able to do this. Obviously, CrowdStrike's one of them, but there's many different partners that are there to help with the management of that.
What about identity governance? Now, you said something about identity management. What are the key developments that are taking place in this particular aspect?
Yeah, the way that I like to think of identity is sort of like this twofold type thing, right? So during my presentation, I spoke about the adversary, and the adversary does three things. They gain initial access, they do post-exploitation, which helps them move laterally, and then they're going to hit you with something. I think identity plays a key role in two of those areas. The most obvious one is the initial access piece. So certainly with issuing central multi-factor authentication and making it to where all the employees are having multi-factor authentication in a uniformed manner across all applications and critical systems. That's one big area. One that's often overlooked, though, is what you can do with identity once inside the system. So this gets to the post-exploitation piece. By limiting employee authorities and by having just-in-time privileges, what you can do is you can make it to where employees can only access what they need to access to do their job. So say, for example, that there was an access technique. Let's say one of the employees was compromised. If that employee's ability to move around is limited, then that is another big area that identity can play a role. So identity solutions that do both, I think, are critical to any modern day identity solution.
Very well said. What about data management? Now, digitalization is increasing, the demand for cybersecurity is increasing, but also I think the demand for data management. But what does that mean now in updated terms?
Yeah, I think when I think about the data management problem, to me, there's two big areas that come up, right? The first of all is, of course, the protection of the data itself. It's like, where am I going to store it? How am I going to protect it? Certainly, cloud is playing a bigger role. More and more companies are moving to the cloud. I remember there was a Gartner statistic where in like 2000, I think it was 2018, maybe like 30% or so companies were moving to the cloud. By 2025, it's going to be closer to 70, 80%, right? So certainly there's this piece of, well, where is the data? How do I protect the data, whether it's on my own servers or in the cloud? But then the other piece around this is the cost of storing data, and that's something that a lot of companies struggle with. So, for example, like a lot of companies will use a SIM. I'm not going to mention names, but really expensive SIMs that are storing all this data, and it's very challenging for a lot of companies. And there's also other solutions. So again, CrowdStrike has one called Humio that basically helps store data that's at a much more efficient way and at a much lower rate. And so I think like it's not only how you protect it, but then it's also like how do I efficiently like pay for this thing as well.
So right now, there's been a large and a very fast change in the whole digital world. A large part of it is because of COVID. I mean, COVID did just in 2 years what cybersecurity would have achieved in a very long time if it wasn't for COVID. But now with all that and with this speed, how do organizations keep up with all these changes?
Yeah, so something I said during the presentation is that the adversary is like water. And so when we think about how water behaves, water doesn't stop when it hits an obstacle. It either rises in level or it moves around it. So if the adversary behaves like water, then it's sort of, we need to have that same level of flexibility in the way that we think. And so during my presentation, I talked about the importance of understanding problems, understanding what is the adversary doing, and then implementing defenses based off what the adversary is doing. So for example, with COVID, we know that COVID forced everybody to have to work from home. And so as a defender, we need to think about, okay, if this thing is happening, how is that changing the environment? So that's where identity becomes a bigger part of the solution. That's where remote workforce solutions become a bigger part of how we solve the problem. So it's basically taking what the threat is doing, taking the current situation, and using those two things to really dictate how you solve the problem, as opposed to like a checklist. Like a lot of organizations, they like to like, oh, what does my checklist say? Okay, the checklist says do this, this, and this, right? So it's really kind of being more dynamic in your approach and thinking more flexibly, like the adversary.
What do you expect to happen in the next few years? I mean, what are the challenges that you see upcoming, or that we all need to be aware of as organizations?
Yeah, so there's an old saying that the best indicator of what's going to happen in the future is probably what's happened in the past. So in the past, what we continue to see is increasing speed. So things like breakout time, I would expect that to continue to decrease. So for example, during the presentation, I said that in 2018, the average criminal breakout time was 9 hours and 40 something minutes. In 2021, 1 hour and 38 minutes. So I would expect that breakout time to continue to decrease. I would expect adversarial attack complexity to continue to increase, right? So they're going to get better at what they do. Not only are they going to get better at what they do, I would also expect the volume of attacks to increase. So I spoke about disciplines and business models such as ransomware as a service. Ransomware as a service is working very well. And so basically it's like all those charts that I showed about an increasing threat, well, yeah, that's going to continue to happen. So again, as defenders, right, if we know that this is the trend, if we know this is the direction it's going, well, then how do we need to think? And that's why solutions such as artificial intelligence, such as using a single platform that has many solutions, using cloud-based technologies, that's why these things are so important, right? It's not necessarily just a business model, but it's pretty much the only option that we have to adapt to an adversary that's evolving at the rate that they're evolving.
Hopefully you will be joining us in the ISC conference next year, but what do you wish to present next year, or you hope that we would accomplish as a field?
Honestly, I would love to present on win cases. Like I want to see a win. I want to see the chart go the other way. I want to see a lower volume of attacks. And what I mean by that is especially volume, right? Because when we think about the volume of attacks, like we can't stop how fast they are. We can't stop their complexity. But I would love to see like less. I would love to see some of these industries really take on, I would love to see an industry really kind of tackle the problem in a very progressive way. And then I would love to highlight that industry as like, hey, look, this is what they're doing. They're focused on these specific areas. They did identity. They're protecting cloud-based systems, so on and so forth, right? And I think that's what society needs. I mean, like, it's one thing for me to go on a stage and say, oh no, the sky is falling. The problem is getting worse. It would be great to go on stage and saying, you know what, yeah, the sky is falling in a lot of places, but look over here. This is a place where it's being done very well. And yeah, I'd love to be able to point to that. So maybe it'll be Saudi Arabia. Let's see.
Thank you for making that so informative in a such short period of time.
Yeah,
It was amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you.